The exhibition that we sent off to the Galt was entitled From Geisha to Diva, and it's dealing with the kimonos and to some extent the life of one of Japan's most famous geisha, known as Ichimaru. So I'm going to start off and give a little bit on what geisha were, the history behind it, and then we'll view Ichimaru's life and her kimono. And it's interesting. She has one of the most interesting lives I think anybody has lived in Japan, and I'm hoping that someday they'll make a movie on her. So this is an image of her in her prime, playing a shamisen, and these are some of the costumes she wore. Now, with geisha, which we'll discuss first, usually they are recognized largely by their white ground on their face, and then red lipstick, and then eyebrows are in black. Geisha, often in the West, are looked upon as something that's immoral or tawdry, or they often say, oh, they're high class or high-paid prostitutes. This is not true at all. They actually had a long and honorable history in Japan. And when we first got the collection donated, a reporter was asking me about how would you describe a geisha in one sentence? So I'm going to read that sentence. I wanted it to be long, so here it goes. Geisha were high-class, well-educated hostess-courtesans who entertained wealthy, sophisticated, and powerful Japanese gentlemen who wished elegance, culture, and brilliant conversation in an exotic atmosphere of decadent refinement. It's a mouthful, but that sort of covers everything, and it's kind of nice. So they're not something that's awful. It's something that people respected them in Japan. In fact, they were considered guardians of Japanese traditions. And you can see how beautiful they were. And I'm going to get into the background behind them now. I think the image might be a bit large here. I'll see if I can get it a little bit smaller. Or else I'll just continue, but I seem to be off to the side. So if you're able to edit this out, so I'm sorry.
Yeah,
okay.
I can edit that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, next one. Here we go. So who wanted the geisha? It was actually men of power often wanted to be with them. It was men like samurai, generals, businessmen, politicians, cabinet members, aristocrats, and even members of the imperial household. Also very educated people, poets, actors, artists, and intellectuals. Why did they want to be with the geisha? They were good entertainment. They were extremely skillful in Japanese traditions. They had studied for long periods of time. But the main thing was they could be trusted for their code of silence. So there's a lot of confidentiality involved here. They didn't want people to know what they were talking about, because if it was businessmen, they might be talking about a takeover. If it was a general or something, they might be talking about war plans. So they knew they could trust the geisha not to say anything. So you see images of geishas quite often being the hostess of the party, and sometimes afterwards they would make arrangements for other things. But not always. You're never guaranteed of having sex with a geisha. In fact, that's not the main reason why everybody sought their company. It's because of their extreme talent in carrying on the conversation. They're very good at current affairs. They talk very politely. They were usually quite funny and often a little bit risque in their chat, sexual innuendos and things like that. So everybody liked them, and they were there for a good time. Now, if you became sort of a lout or loud and drunk, as you can see this print at the very bottom in the middle, it shows a fellow being escorted out because she didn't want anything to do, and he was just being too awful. So you're never guaranteed of sex. In fact, in many cases, sex was not part of the deal. And then you'd still get a huge, gigantic bill if you didn't behave properly. So they had that amount of power, and they were exceptionally expensive in old Japan. Now, where did they get the awful reputation as being high-class prostitutes? From the Americans, of course. One of the movies they made in 1958 with John Wayne was called The Barbarian and the Geisha. And actually, it's based on a real man who was the U.S. Consul General of Japan in the mid-19th century, named Townsend Harris. He didn't have a geisha as his translator, but in this role, this particular woman plays his liaison officer. But people have the wrong idea about geisha from the Americans, and I'll explain why. When the war was finished in 1945, the American troops occupied Japan, and Japan became exceptionally poor. The war had been very hard on them. In order to feed families, there was a large amount of prostitution. The women who took part in this profession called themselves geisha girls. They were not geisha, they were just ordinary prostitutes, but that name became associated with prostitutes. And you can see the different images here of them looking after some of the troops. There is actually one image at the bottom, which is a postcard that was sent and says Japanese prostitutes. Actually, those were the Japanese geisha at the very bottom right-hand side. And this was a way to simply survive. And if you look at some of the old writings on this, a lot of American GIs were involved with this. From 1945 to 49, a lot of them did visit these brothels. And even after that, when they were involved in the Korean War, it was a place where a lot of troops were stationed before they went to Korea. So it had this reputation, and a lot of men of that era from World War II do have fond memories of their time in Japan. So it sort of, they went crazy about the Japanese women, in fact. And in 1974, when President Gerald Ford was there, you can see they were from that era of World War II. They're sort of looking at the geisha, and they're sort of being funny and weird. It's partly because of the mystique of them. And you see Rumsfeld involved at the top right, and then Henry Kissinger on the bottom left. So they're a little bit goofy with them. And this is partly because of this idea of romance with the Japanese geisha. But actually the regular soldiers did not have geisha. It was something else. So what sort of helped the reputation of the geisha was a book written by Arthur Golden. And he wrote, it was called Memoirs of a Geisha. And he had interviewed a number of geisha in Japan, and one in particular, but he made into a story, not all totally true, but based on several geisha. And it's quite close to being what a geisha's life would be like. In fact, when they were just about to make the movie, I got a call at the gallery because they heard of our collection of geisha costumes, and they wanted to borrow them for the movie. And it was Steven Spielberg's studio. And unfortunately, the costumes were on display and I think in San Francisco, and we couldn't loan them, thank goodness. Anyways, they did make this nice film. And the one thing is the Japanese didn't like it overly well because the two main stars were actually Chinese. They had better English than the Japanese actresses which were being considered. So the Japanese sort of, they didn't have good feelings about this, but that's part of the reason why. Now, I'll explain a little bit about when the geisha first began to appear. They began to appear in the Edo period. The Edo period lasts from 1603 until 1868. At that time, Japan was going through a peaceful period because the country had been unified. The samurai had unified the country. So society was divided into 4 classes. The emperor was at the very top, but he was only a figurehead. The real power was the shogun. He was the military leader. And under him were feudal lords called daimyo, and then samurai, which were their soldiers. They would keep the peace, and ronin. So that's the first class, so known as the warrior class. The second class were the peasants, and they were the poorest class, but they were considered essential to keeping the country fed. So they had that the status of being second class and considered very important. 90% of the population were peasants. And then comes the craftspeople. They made umbrellas, fans, sandals, furniture. So they were the third class. And at the very bottom were the merchants. Everybody hated them because they seemed to be getting a lot of money. They considered them sort of parasites. And but they became so wealthy that the bottom class was wealthier than the other classes. So it didn't seem fair. But anyways, they would become artisans and merchants were often called the townspeople, and they would frequent the brothels and the geisha houses during the Edo period. So that's the background behind the period when they began forming. Also, kabuki formed at the same time. Kabuki was the main theater of Japan, and the very first performers in Kyoto were women, and Okuni is said to have founded it in the early 17th century. And she would dance with her troupe, which were also all female, but it excited the crowd, and inevitably prostitution developed because they were excited by the dancing, and the audience were hiring them. So the government at the time worried about what this could lead to. So in 1629, they banned women from performing. So all the performances had to be done by men. In the past, the women were doing the male and female roles. Now the men had to do it. So at first, they chose young boys to play the women, but it seemed the crowd was still interested in the young boys. So they had to ban young boys as well and make sure that everybody who played a woman, and that's called onigata, a female impersonator, were men roughly around 40 and up. So quite often when you see images in woodblock prints of the so-called Japanese women in kabuki, they were not good looking. They were actually older men. Just like in Shakespearean plays, all the parts were played by men. So this sort of had a big relationship with the geisha, because this was roughly the time when geisha were also beginning to be into entertainers. Now, the very first geisha, quite often you would have them organize parties before or after the kabuki, and it was males. They were often jesters, and comedians and acrobats even, and they would perform for the crowds of people before they went usually at tea houses, and eventually women would take over. And there were the women would start taking over in 1730, and by 1780, almost every single geisha was a female. But to this day, there are approximately 3 of them that have survived and still survive, being known as male geisha. So they were entertainers to start off with, but it was taken over by the women because they had basically been kicked out of the theater. In Japan, they had red light districts in the major cities, usually fenced off outside the city. And in Tokyo, it was known as the Yoshiwara. And this is where you'd find regular prostitutes and high class prostitutes, which are known as courtesans. It would be these courtesans which would eventually have the influence and the beginning of the female geisha. A lot of the courtesans were famous for their looks and their clothing, but they had no talent in terms of knowledge on things. They were just respected for their beauty. And some of these were actually, or a good portion of them were samurai daughters, because the samurais were being funded by government stipends. They didn't have a lot of money. So a lot of them moved into, the daughters moved into the profession of being high-class courtesans. The geisha began being required for these entertainment parties. Gei actually means art or accomplished, and sha means person. So accomplished person of the arts, you could call it. And they began moving in, and they were the full deal. They weren't just pretty and nice clothing. They also had a huge background of knowledge, and they were very smart, and they were considered for their ability at talking with people and entertaining people. So they actually slowly took over the courtesans, or the orion as they're called, and it became geisha, and the orion largely disappeared. Now, in particular in the 19th century, the geisha were sort of depicted on these pinup prints, known as woodblock prints or ukiyo-e prints. And they're beautiful. These were what people could buy for a few pennies and put them up in their houses. As I said, sort of like a pinup. And they have become quite valuable. They did have a lot of influence on European post-impressionist art. But look how beautiful the costumes are. So there's a long history of the costumes. First, it started with the courtesans, and then the geisha began wearing them as well. And this is one of the main art forms of Japan, is woodblock prints. There usually are 4 main types. One is landscape, legendary scenes, actors, and beautiful women. And the geisha fill that role. So a lot of these very important women were preserved through all the printing of these prints, and we can find them still to this day. This is a print that I just bought, in fact, a few weeks ago for the art gallery, and it shows geishas at a geisha house wearing their newest fashions, which they are seen wearing here. Now, how important were they? They were really important to cities, and I'll tell you why. This is Kyoto. This is the Gion district, where you have tea houses, and this is where they would entertain their clients. Whereas the courtesans and the prostitutes were restricted to the red light districts, the geisha tended to be in geisha houses called okiya, and they would work from there and be hired from there. And this is a quarter in Kyoto. And to show you how important that they considered it, it was made a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so they've preserved it now. And you can still go there and see the place where they largely worked. Now, geishas sort of were standouts. They always traveled. Everything had to be first class. They elevated themselves to being respected in society. So quite often you would see them in the streets, usually in a rickshaw, which is very expensive, or on a palanquin, also very expensive. Some of the pictures you see here are actually from a collector in Edmonton named Arlene Hall, and some from our collection. So it shows you they would never travel economy class. They had to show that they were important, and people began respecting them, admiring them, and looking up to them as sort of female icons. Now, for a while, they even tried wearing a few Western-style dresses, as you can see in these two prints here, as compared with the kimono. The kimonos won out in the end. A lot of Japanese didn't like foreign things coming in, because the Edo period, when it ended, the foreigners began coming in. And they didn't like the foreign influence that much in terms of women's costumes and behavior. So even though they came in and had costumes, and this is the early 20th century, the regular Japanese men did not like it. They want things to be more traditional in the kimono style. So the geisha were actually preserved the old culture, especially the kimono that were being worn. So that represents largely the Edo period style. And the new style, of course, most of the people were turning to Western clothing, but not the geisha. Now, where do they actually come from? They actually come from poor families. Quite often in Japan, you would have large family, and if you didn't have enough money, you might sell your daughter to a brothel or a geisha house, because not a lot of money around. So it came from the poor people. And once you sold them, you could sell them to a brothel, which was not going to be a very nice life, or sell them to a geisha house. So a lot of them, the ones you see in the geisha house came from these poor families. And they usually were sold sometime between the age of 6 and 11, and they became servants. And if they showed talents, they could be elevated at 11 or 12 to become maiko, which was sort of apprentice geisha, and then eventually become a geisha. They had to show talent and ability at learning things. And so when they first arrived, they were assigned a older geisha who was sort of like a sister, and they sort of followed them around carrying umbrellas, doing little chores. But when they left the family, it was pretty hard. Some of them, especially if they were in a regular brothel, it was not very nice for them. And they're expected to send money back to their parents if possible in the future. A lot of them never did. They were never to run away. Otherwise, the parents would have to reimburse the geisha house or whatever for the cost of buying them. So they were indentured. They were indebted to it. And once the second they arrived at the geisha house, they were being supplied with food, with clothing, medical coverage, and a tab was set up. So they were immediately in debt to the geisha house, and it would, as they got older, it would get bigger and bigger. So they were stuck there until they could pay it off. So when they eventually would be getting a salary as a geisha, they would have to be paying the geisha house, okiya. And also there was a okasen, who was the mother or the person in charge, and she would be their manager of the geisha. So we're first looking at them as being maiko. So the maiko you can see here, she's accompanying an older geisha, and they refer to it sort of as a sisterhood, but now they're totally away from their family. They had to grow up very quickly. It was a disciplined life, and they had to follow them around. You can see that captured in woodblock prints and old photographs in the rickshaw. Again, very expensive. Most of the time you'd be walking. A geisha would never be seen walking. They were always wanted to elevate themselves above that. So these are sort of idyllic shots of the young girls when they become maiko, or the apprentice geisha. And you can see all the expensive kimonos. So that was building up. So they'd have these huge bills, which would be on their tab for this. So in 1956, when they made prostitution illegal in Japan, they did not touch the geisha. The geisha were considered something different. They had a huge amount of knowledge. They were trained in various arts. Brilliant when it comes to conversation. They studied the old style of conversation. They are dressed beautifully. So they were not considered as a prostitute. As I mentioned before, you're never guaranteed of sex. In fact, probably in many of the occasions, no sex was involved. But they were elevated because they had a great deal of respect. And usually the higher people from the higher classes were interested in them. So they started from a very early age. From being a servant at the age of about 12 or so, they were starting to be trained as a maiko, and with party games, conversation, with music. They played drums, flutes, but it's that little banjo there that they mainly played, and that was considered their main instrument to play. And it took years of training, and you had to pay the teachers to come to your geisha house, or else they'd go to a school to learn it. All this was building up. And the shamisen's quite beautiful. It's very good for singing with. The actual bottom part of it was made of cat skin, occasionally dog skin. And nowadays, of course, they use plastic, but it was considered the main musical instrument for the geisha. You also had to learn dancing and how to move. Now, when a geisha walked in, you could hear her kimono rubbing against itself, and it was just considered so sexy, this slow whooshing as they came in. So everything about her was special. And they knew all about poetry. They could write poetry, calligraphy. They knew all about the tea ceremony. It was really an art form in Japan to serve tea. So they were very sophisticated. And this is what a lot of Japanese gentlemen liked to be entertained with. They knew ikebana. Everything was being taught to them. So they were not the ordinary Japanese woman. They were trained from head to toe. They were a work of art. Here's them learning how to fold napkins. But as I mentioned, they had to really know the conversation of the old style. They had to know current events quite well, and sometimes the gossip of actors and things. They became the unparalleled conservators of the traditional costume, music, song, and dance. So they were preserving Japan's past. That's why so many people like them. In the old days, the geisha were considered a valued possession of a city and a measure of its vitality. They came to be referred to as living treasures of Japan, or living works of art. From head to toe, they were works of art. Magnificent costumes, magnificent brain. So it was the complete deal. So you would be a maiko, an apprentice, until the age of sometime between 17 and 19, and then you'd be deflowered in a ceremony known as mitsuaga. And you would, and the clients would pay high prices to be able to deflower a maiko. And once they became once they became deflowered, they no longer wore the red collar. They would change it to white. That means they had become a full-fledged geisha. In the past, they had to keep their hair neat all the time, so they had to sleep on these awful pillows, which you see to the left, and very hard. So you didn't want to muss your hair. But once you became a geisha, you had the chance to wear a white collar and wear a wig, so you didn't have to worry, and you could sleep on nice pillows. This is a wig which is in the exhibition. It is actually made of hair imported from China with yak tail. That made it really, and then you'd oil it down and made it a very full wig, and you could put this on and off, and you'd have to have it fixed about every 2 weeks. And this is the one that Ichimaru wore. We had a little bit of problem with this when we sent the exhibition to the US. You notice that little orange ball at the top. It got to one of the border places, and the customs officer said it was coral, and we forced the shipment to go back to the art gallery. It was a piece of plastic, and they wouldn't hear. So anyways, we took it out. But that little piece of plastic cost us a lot of money to have it go back to the border and down again. Whole story behind that, but I won't get into it now. But this is in the exhibition. This is what the geisha would wear. And it was sort of had a aluminum foil netting at the bottom for all the hairs to be put in. So it was very, very expensive to have these wigs done. And this is what a geisha would look like before she put the wig on. So she got to sleep on a nice pillow, but and then the geisha wig would be placed on top. Makeup was very important, also very expensive. So that's another thing that builds up in cost. And here's something that happened in the early days of the geisha. They loved to put on the white makeup, but it had a lead compound in it, and it caused skin disease, premature aging. And it wasn't until about the mid 19th century that they began using a rice powder, so that it allowed them to have a white complexion. And so it wasn't very nice the old days. Now, in the West, quite often, Western men seem to like cleavage or derrieres or whatever. In Japan, they like the nape of the neck, considered the most sexy part of a woman. So quite often they decorated it like this. It looks like 2 fingers going up or 3 fingers going down. And it was quite often in Japanese art, you will see women being depicted from the back with their neck design. Now, what about sex? So as I mentioned, it wasn't the main thing which they were famous for, but they often did have books, albums. In fact, Ichimaru had a whole set. And it was just thought that these were largely for visual stimulation or for education. When I was growing up in the 1970s, there was Alex Comfort's The Joy of Sex, which was a bestseller. And it's more or less said that sex is fun. And the Japanese never really considered sex as something bad. It wasn't until the Puritanian Westerners came in and they began to realize that, we can't have prostitution and things like that. But anyways, she had this whole set of books, which is also in the art gallery's collection. And it was thought it was for arousing perhaps her customers. These are not considered bad. 10% of all woodblock prints that are made were the erotic type. And it was made by some of the best artists of Japan, like Hokusai and Hiroshige. It was just something that could be found in all over Japan. Samurais originally had these because they had to spend 1 year at the capital and then go to the prefecture with their feudal lord. And the wives and mistresses were left in the capital, so they didn't have any relationship with women for a whole year, and then they would come back. So they often had these. But recently, they found in some of the gazetteers that women who were left behind were also buying these erotic prints. So it's kind of interesting from that aspect. So if you were a geisha, you would be with these huge, gigantic tabs owed to the geisha house. If you were lucky, you could find a man with style, and he might buy out your tab and set you up in your own house or geisha house and look after you. These are scenes from movies, so these aren't actually, but they were called danas, a sponsor, and they had iki, sort of a trendsetters. Everybody was looking for them. So quite often it would be older men too, and they could set themselves up and leave the geisha house and just be for one man. So you see them walking around, you can immediately tell they're geisha, but nowadays more and more people are putting on costumes just as costume play. So they're not necessarily geisha either. Now, what about the wives versus the geisha? The wives often knew that their husband had geishas as on the side. But a lot of the marriages in Japan had been arranged. And a lot of Japanese men felt they grew up with the notion that women were there to serve them. So their mothers babied them, their wives babied them, and their daughters babied them. So they were fussed over it. They just liked that so much. But the wife, in many cases, didn't really care if there was a geisha on the side, because quite often Japanese men, especially businessmen, would have parties with colleagues or with their workers, and she didn't have to worry about entertaining them. They would, they'd quite often go out and to restaurants and get a little bit tipsy, and she didn't have to deal with that. She was at home, whereas the geisha was the one who would look after the party, if you will, and she wasn't exposed to that. She had to stay at home and look after the children. Quite often, they say of the Japanese women that they were for wives, they were for procreation, for raising the children, household affairs, and usually when you talk with them, it's very sincere stuff. But with the geisha, it was recreation. They were fun, they were risque, they knew public affairs, they were educated, and they were so knowledgeable that men of intellect wanted to be with them. There's a nice quote on the side there, if you have a chance to read that, of what geisha, the purpose for educated men was to entertain them nicely. So it's not necessarily, as I keep repeating, for sex. It was for what they provided, company, good conversation, and it made you feel. It was a snob appeal as well, that if only very high people could afford to be with geisha. The person who helped me write the catalog, she's quite elderly now. She was saying that when her father died, I think it was in the 1950s, she was with her mother, and this very well-dressed youngish woman came in. The mother nodded, and the other woman nodded back, and she knew that her father had had a geisha on the side. And probably there was no animosity, as probably the first time they'd seen each other. And actually, you recognize that as part of life in Japan. So, but the most expensive thing for geisha when they were being trained and everything was their kimono. These kimonos sometimes would take 2 and 3 weeks to make. They're tailor-made. You'd have one of a kind. And it involved a lot of money. So this is another thing where your debt to the geisha house really built up. And you had to have dozens and dozens. Some are said to even have had hundreds of different costumes for different seasons, different events, different festivals, and you didn't want to be seeing the same one twice. So you can see the beautiful ones here involved. But most of the time, these costumes do not survive because the Japanese weren't fond of secondhand clothing, so they disappeared. We were very fortunate to get the wardrobe of the geisha Ichimaru. This is one that's in the exhibition right now. You can see it looks like a very tall person. Actually, she was quite short. In the middle is where you bunch it up together and it becomes quite bumpy. And then you put a sash or obi around your waist. And that's the main purpose of the obi, is to keep everything up. So even though this looks like it's for a tall person, Ichimaru herself was less than 5 feet. So some of the textiles in the exhibition, like this one, they're on sort of a woven silk pattern. This is called damask. And then you embroider something over top. And again, look in the middle. There's not much decoration in the middle all the time. So there's really an art form. In some cases, you can actually find the maker, their seal on it, some of the high-up designers. This is one that she wore in 1933 when she was the lead singer for a movie called Wet Swallow. And you can see there's swallows on the clothesline there on the, I think it's obis, and they're flying through it. So we do have some very early ones of her time. And this is another one of my favorites. It has 2 peacocks on it. One's embroidered and one is dyed. And they're quite magnificent. And look at how well they work together. And they're just made of everything. There's all sorts of dyeing, embroidery techniques, and sometimes combination of several different designs. So they really are fine works of art. This is one that she wore in Hawaii. I'll get to that shortly later on in the talk here about this. But if you hear me referring to the Hawaii kimono, it's this one. This is another one. It's one of the nicest one in the exhibition. And this is something that would probably take weeks and weeks to do. It's embroidered with gold thread, in very good condition. You'd wear these, and if there's stains got on them, you would usually, and you couldn't get the stain out, you'd get rid of them. So these are very expensive. You looked after it. Here you can see the one in the middle and the one on the left are quite beautiful designs. One's of the forest and one shows, I think it's flowers and things. Quite nice, the purple one. And the other one shows cranes. But they're beautifully done. And on these, the one in the middle and on the left, if you go down to the bottom on the right side, you see little marks. That is the mark of the designer. There doesn't seem to be any books on it, so we weren't able to find out who they were, but they were the top designers of costumes for the geisha. And in some cases, like on the black one at the top, you can see these little marks on the shoulders and on the top of the sleeves. They're known as mons. Sometimes it's a family crest, maybe sometimes of the designer, sometimes of the geisha house. So there's all sorts of interesting things that you see on these. And then this is kind of interesting thing. It's in the exhibition. You see, it looks like a long piece of cloth. It's more than 4 meters long. I think it's more like 8 meters, if I'm not mistaken. And it's been sewn together. It actually was a kimono, and you take it totally apart and you sew the little pieces together, which you can see on the left there, and it becomes this one long piece. And that's how you wash them. You'd have them taken apart, washed, and then put back together again. So it was a very expensive process. But in those days in Japan, somebody could do that in, let's say, a day, and it wouldn't cost very much, especially for what a geisha would be making at the time. It's really interesting to see it that way. It was actually on an album cover, but we never had it put back together again because I just think it's nice to have an example like this. And if you go on the internet and you want to make yourself a kimono, you only need roughly 4 meters by 1 meter, and you can make yourself a kimono. And then, of course, if you're a little bit bigger, you'd have to have more length. But they're one of the easiest things to make. So just go on the internet if you want to make yourself your own kimono. Now, the exhibition has traveled to several different places, including the National Geographic Museum in Washington, D.C. It's been to San Francisco, Dallas, Baton Rouge, and a number of other places. Beautifully displayed here. There's her shamisen, which we have, which is kind of strange. So that, like Jimi Hendrix's guitar is worth a lot of money because he was such a famous guitar player. This is the most talented geisha of early Japan, and we actually have it in our collection. So it's kind of nice. Oops, I touched the wall on there, sorry. And there's a way to display geisha costumes is always with the back showing, and then you flare it out or butterfly it out, and it looks quite beautiful. Look on the left there. If you go to the right of that, you can see how it's displayed if you do it from the front. It doesn't look nearly as nice because you miss the pattern. You only see little pieces of the pattern. The best way to display it is with the back out. This is show. It was in Kelowna, and unfortunately, it came up at the same time COVID got going. So they had a lot of visual shows with it, and people walked through or went through that, and then near the end they were able to open it up to the public a little bit. But we're having the same problem a little bit here in Alberta, in Galt, with Corona COVID again, so that's too bad. Hopefully people will have a chance to see it. We did do 2 books with the collections. One is still available, that's on the right, and you can I think get it at the Galt museum shop. It does illustrate a lot of them. The one on the right, of course, has most things in color. The other one now is selling on the internet, and I think it's Amazon Books for something ridiculous like $60 or $70 when we were selling it originally for about $8. So, but the one on the right, I think is, I'm not sure the value of it, but you can still get a hold of it, I believe, at the gallery or the museum shop. It tells all about geisha. And the costumes, and in more detail, it explains about the costumes. Now I'm going to tell briefly about Ichimaru's life story. She started out in a very poor farming family near Nagano. She was one of 11 children. The first 10 born were girls. The 11th one was a boy. He eventually died in young age. So the family was very poor. In order to survive, they sold off Ichimaru. That's her later name. And she was sold to a very bad place. She wasn't sold as a servant. She was immediately sold as a hot springs geisha. It was not very nice for her. Can you imagine at the age of 14 being sent to a place like this? It was not very pleasant. She showed a lot of talent. She became quite a good singer, and people began to refer to her as the Nightingale singer. And eventually somebody in Tokyo heard about her, and somehow she managed to get herself out. So from about 1920 to 25, she was in this awful place and managed to get herself out because she was so talented, and began singing in restaurants, found her way to Tokyo, where she was picked up by a bigger geisha house and was trained better and became one of the top geishas in all of Japan. So she started out in a very, very, very unpleasant situation in the hot springs geisha. It was basically prostitution, and it was not nice for her. She never forgave her parents for selling her. In future times, some of her sisters would contact her, and she would help educate them and give them some money. So she was quite generous to her sisters, but she never forgave her parents for what they did to her. Here's her roughly at the age of between 25 and 30. Very beautiful. This is when she was a full-fledged professional geisha in Tokyo. Very skilled at the shamisen and the koto. And lo and behold, and we don't know a lot about her life because there's such secrecy in geishas and how they lived and how their life story. So most of the stories we just have a little bit on her, so we don't know a lot about it. We do know that when RCA Victor showed up in the early 1930s to Japan to record the best Japanese singers, they went to the geisha houses because they are the ones most famous as singers. And Ichimaru became one of the most important singers in all of Japan. And as in 1933, she recorded the Wet Swallow Song, and then several others. It made her wealthy enough that she was able to buy her own tab and become her own boss. In other words, she was able to leave that geisha house. And she continued to live like a geisha, buying geisha clothing and performing in geisha makeup and paraphernalia right until she was in her 90s. She would perform into the 1990s, and she had her own radio show, own variety show, like an Ed Sullivan type thing. And she just became very famous, and therefore she no longer, she could choose whoever she wanted, but she never did get married. There were posters made of her, and many records were done. Here's a very famous artist, Kiyoshi Kobayakawa. He won an award making a print of her. He fell in love with her. Of course, he couldn't afford her, so she never did have a long-term relationship with him. He did do some very nice paintings of her, which again won awards. One's in the Fukuoka Art Museum, and the other known one is in our collection and in the exhibition. It's the one at the bottom left here. So those are the only two. A lot of them are destroyed during the war. And that particular artist made the very famous image here of Tipsy. It's not Ichimaru, but it's very famous. It looks like a little bit like Betty Boop. In fact, there's some people that say this might have been the idea for Betty Boop, but who knows? Anyways, she remained. Never did fall in love with anybody, and she sort of taught that from the geishahood. You don't fall in love with people because you can't have that. But she's the one. She became her own boss, got out of it. Very determined woman. She also played a small role, very, very small, in saving Charlie Chaplin's wife. Charlie Chaplin. He was traveling with his newly fiancée, his wife, Paulette Goddard, to Japan in 1932. He was invited by Prime Minister Inukai to open a few buildings and had a reception at his home. And Charlie Chaplin said, "I just arrived, and I'd like to be entertained by a geisha. I'd like to meet with a Japanese kabuki actor, and I'd like to see some sumo wrestling." So Inukai, Prime Minister Inukai said, okay. And so away he went, and he would see the mayor of Tokyo that day, kabuki actor, and be entertained by Ichimaru. You can see her in the central picture here playing the shamisen, enjoyed a lot. Meanwhile, and the next thing after this was to go to the sumo wrestling. Meanwhile, on the right side, you see Prime Minister Inukai. He was assassinated that very evening by 11 naval cadets. Why? He was a diplomatic fellow. He wanted peace. The military hated him because he was not militaristic. He was assassinated by these 11 cadets. And they had hoped, they had heard that Charlie Chaplin was going to be there, so they were hoping that they could kill Charlie Chaplin at the same time. Why? Because it was Chaplin, this is what the head of the assassin said, Koga. Chaplin is a popular figure in the United States and the darling of the capitalist class. We believe that killing him would cause a war with America. They wanted to start a war in 1932. They didn't realize that Charlie Chaplin was actually British. Anyways, they did manage to kill the prime minister. There's a little view of it in a movie here called The Revolt. But these guys, after killing a prime minister and several people on the way in there, were given very light jail terms. And then eventually they were even pardoned because the military had taken over. And this is the beginning of Japan's dark age, when they began getting involved with the war with China and then World War II. But this is, so I always say that Ichimaru had a tiny part in maybe saving Charlie Chaplin's life, because the fact that he wanted to be entertained by sumo, geisha, and kabuki. So during the war, Ichimaru did perform for the troops, both, it said, abroad and at home. And she developed these large-scale kimono programs for them. After the war, she went into hiding because she was a little bit worried about being like a Tokyo Rose, who was being used for propaganda during the war. So, but she reemerged in 1948, did a few movies. She did a Western movie called Tokyo File 212, in which she met Florence Marley and Robert Payton and did a song in that. And in the movie, she actually was said to be the #1 geisha of Japan. So she had a nice career. The bottom picture there, I think, is Rod Cameron. He was a Canadian actor from Calgary. Anyway, she was meeting with these people, really well known, appreciated. She began being on radio and TV, always performing as a geisha for the rest of her life. And she recorded in around 1950 or so, a record called Shamisen Boogie Woogie, based on American folk songs and combined with jazz. And it became the best seller ever. And per capita, and considering its time, it is still considered the best selling record ever in Japan. You see how beautiful she was when she composed that. And these are some of her other record album covers. Now, we happened to find a short 1.5 minute performance of her when she was 63. She still looks good at 63.
はい、Ichimaruさんの三味線ブギウギ。さあさあ踊ろうよブギウギウキウキ浮いた浮いたよシャシャリツシャンシャン踊るアホに踊るアホだよ同じアホなら奥さんにゃそうだよさあさあ猫もシャクシもブギウギはちょいとブギウギ踊ろうよブギウギウキウキ風に大きにシャシャリツシュンシュン踊りゃよくなるますますよくなるナスもかぼちゃもケーキもよくなるさあさあスイートブギウギはちょいとブギウギ
So that was her performing there. And that song you may recognize if any of you have watched the old MASH series. Occasionally, Hawkeye Pierce and Trapper John would go to Japan on furlough when they were in the Korean War, and they actually played that song in the background. I'm not sure it was actually by her or just somebody doing the rendition, but it's kind of neat. There's a picture of her on the left side, shows her when she was 40. I think most attractive in her lifetime was when she was a bit older. Here shows her slowly progressing through time, always performing and composing. We actually, at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, we have some of her compositions in which you see that she wrote songs. She's a super talented woman. And again, she did it by herself. So there are some people who are even jealous of her because she was so beautiful, so popular, and so talented. She would receive awards from the imperial family, the 4th Imperial Order of Precious Treasures in 1990. First one she received was the Order of the Purple Ribbon in 1955. She couldn't get the Living National Treasure one because of her original profession, but she was awarded whatever high awards that she could get because she preserved the culture of a Japanese song and dance better than anybody else. So she would die in 1997 at the age of 91. Broke. Her maid had robbed her just shortly before she died. She was heartbroken, of more than $1 million. She did not press charges, but a wonderful woman, very famous. Whenever I travel in Japan, I meet some older people. I find that they do know who she is. Now, the geisha, I'm going to be finished in 1 minute, so just bear with me. The geisha you can still see in Japan, but largely they become entertainers. And right now, a lot of foreigners, Germans, Chinese and everybody else are copying them and walking in the streets looking like this. You have to be sure you're getting the genuine Japanese person. So it's kind of interesting. The Japanese look best. The one in the top left is quite beautiful. The others are, as I say, some various Western countries. You can tell by the noses. The traditional Japanese, they were geisha were quite beautiful over time. And this is what one geisha said: a geisha contains her art within herself, and because her body has this art, her life is saved. That is the power of art, the salvation of one's soul. And as time went on, they became less and less popular. They seem to be frozen in time, something archaic. None of the young men seem to like them anymore. These are some of the numbers if you look at them. So they were, quite a few were around in the early 20th century. During the 1930s, the dirty 30s, it was a very bad time, and they said that up to 200,000 girls were sold to brothels and geisha houses at that time. 1970s, it goes down a bit. And right now, there's hardly any that are in it. And they're more performers than they are for anything to do with the sex trade. Foreigners quite often get their hire one just to be seen with them because they are the old traditional Japanese performers. I was thought, well, this is kind of a nice picture. I'm going to see if I can find a sleazy one, a little bit more sleazy. And well, you know, I found myself on the internet, which I didn't know about. I'd been on one of these, or I've been on several of these private jet tours where there's 60 people, and I'm the lecturer, the expert on it. And we are entertained by geisha, and some of them came to even know me quite well because I think I did about 6 of these trips. And they always referred to me as the Ichimaru man, because when I told them about Ichimaru, they're all quite excited. The other man there was the doctor on the trip. But as I said, I was looking for other foreigners and spotted this. Can't find it anymore on the internet, but there I was. So it was kind of neat. And there she is. The reason why we got the collection was because her executor and best friend, Fumi Suzuki, inherited the costumes, and she gave a few to the Nagano gallery where she grew up nearby, Nagano Museum. And she contacted a woman in Vancouver, Yoshiko Kawasawa, who Karasawa. I have pronounced trouble. It's Yoshi anyways. And she contacted me, and when I heard it on the phone, I was just so excited, and we were able to get this into our collection. So thanks to those two women, we have a nice collection in Victoria, probably the best geisha collection of kimonos outside of Japan. And it's a brilliant story. I'm hoping that someday, as I said, a movie's going to be made of her. I'm going to finish my lecture here, but I'm going to quickly show you her home. It's been turned into an art gallery, which you see on the side there. I was contacted as a result of the show by a Dr. Jude, who's going to be writing a book on her, I hope. And she's going to do more research, and then we'll maybe have even a more detailed story of her life. But the show has been a lot of fun putting up. I originally put it up back in 1999. That's when we got the collection. So it's been going around all over the United States and Canada. So I hope you'll have a chance to get in and see it. It's a lot of fun. Okay, thank you for listening.